what I often see happen, this is a very common pitfall in the Bitcoin community, is that you overaccumulate. And what I mean by overaccumulation is not good, right? Overaccumulation in Bitcoiners' minds is like, I have more Bitcoin. Everything's going to be awesome. Bitcoin's inevitable. It's going to $1 million. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to retire. I'm going to flip off my boss. Everything's going to be cool. No, what actually happens with overaccumulation is that you've now levered up and now you don't have cash flow to pay for things, and you're usually selling at the worst possible time. So overaccumulation generally leads to less Bitcoin that people have in their pockets rather than more Bitcoin. Yeah, there's going to be people, of course, that somehow get the timing right by the grace of God, and they're able to, for whatever reason, lever up and get in at the right time and get out at the right time, and they end up with more than they otherwise would have. That's a very small percentage of people. That's like less than 1% of people. They get the timing right, because it's not just the timing on the way in that you have to get right. It's also the timing on the way out that you have to get right. And people are notoriously bad at both. So it's like you have to have both right in order to do it. And so I tell this to people all the time, is like, create a cash surplus, right? And once you have that cash surplus, if you don't need that money for other things, then yeah, go buy Bitcoin. But if you also don't have any kind of emergency reserve, then you might also end up in this situation where, all of a sudden your hot water heater floods your house, right? And insurance only covers a portion of it, whatever it is. And you have to replace the hot water heater, right? And you have to replace all this stuff. And you weren't expecting $15,000. And now you're selling your Bitcoin at the worst possible time, right? I feel like people don't really think of these things, and what they think of is like, oh, I'll just borrow against my Bitcoin. And it's like, okay, but now you have to go like in the midst of an emergency, go find a lender, probably give them your private keys, because the lenders where you don't have to give them your private keys are mostly businesses that are taking business loans at this point. So like that lending market's not really that mature yet, so I wouldn't rely on that. Or they're like, I'm just going to put it on my credit card. And now you've got this situation where you've got credit card debt and you have over accumulation of Bitcoin, quote unquote, and you have no cash. And you're now paying off, a credit card loan at 30% or more, whatever it is, especially in this interest rate environment. And so I feel like one small thing, like little mistakes, they start to add up, and you can end up in a really, really bad situation if you don't stop yourself early.
It's great advice, because I'm pretty sure, myself included, and probably everybody who will listen to this has probably been in the situation where you get to a point where you don't even have the fiat to keep buying the dip. Like you're like, shoot, like somehow the dip keeps dipping, but like I'm out of fiat. Like there's no more I can allocate. Like I have, other bills that I need to pay and things like that's okay. I guess I'm not, I'm getting halfway down this dip, but I don't get the tastiest part of the bottom. And then you're kind of kicking yourself. Well, like, why did I do that? You try to zoom out and think, well, okay, again, to your point, Bitcoin's inevitable. If I just wait, long enough, I'll be good. I'll get back in the black. Fiat's going to zero anyway. I'm going to change my unit of account to Bitcoin. But still, anyone would rather accumulate more Bitcoin than accumulate less Bitcoin. And I think what you said about over accumulating, actually the more likely situation there being ending up with less Bitcoin than with more, is kind of fascinating and maybe a little bit counterintuitive on its face, but it makes perfect sense. It's like if you're going to get forced liquidated, basically, and I'm not talking like a margin call or something, I'm not talking about that. I'm saying like if you are forced to liquidate part of your stack for an emergency, because shit happens. When it rains, it pours. It all tends to come at once. And it also tends to come around the time that Bitcoin just happens to be taking a dump, right? And so, it's like all of this confluence of things comes together. And now all of a sudden you're in a forced liquidation scenario, which you don't want to be. If you're going to sell some of your Bitcoin, you want that to be on your terms, on your timeline. And it's not a very desirable situation to kind of have to be backed into a corner, basically. So yeah, I appreciate that advice a lot. And I'm curious also. So, you mentioned emergency stashes. Do you have, just like getting into nitty gritty a little bit, do you have like a percentage of how do you do that? Do you do it like a percentage of their net worth? Do you do it as just like, okay, this is a generally good number for most people. If you're, have a young family, if you own a house, things like that. How do you even go about deciding like, okay, because I'm sure there are people wondering like, okay, how much dirty fiat do I actually need to keep on hand for it to be prudent?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of things that actually play into emergency fund. I mean, you can make it really simple and you can just say, I want to have 3 to 6 months worth of cash, right? That's what most financial advisors are going to tell you. I think if anything, you could be a little more aggressive with your emergency fund by like cherry picking what you actually need to put in your emergency fund. I like to do this for Bitcoiners because Bitcoiners don't like to hold fiat. And so like, if you don't want to take the standard 3 to 6 months advice, fine. Okay. Do you own a house, right? If you do own a house, then like, is it an old house? Is it a new house? Like you probably probably need to have some sort of reserve of generally 1 to 3% of the home purchase in emergency funds for when things come up. That's generally what I recommend. For a newer house, we're usually erring more on the 1% side. For an older house, on the 3% side of like the total home value. We look at how stable is somebody's income, right? If somebody has like a very stable income, they've been working for, same company for a really long time, they're really well respected, they're high up in there, they're always going to get their regular paycheck, right? It's very unlikely that they're laid off. That person doesn't need 6 months worth of emergency reserve as much as maybe somebody who's freelancing, right? You should probably err more on the 6 month side. And so you can maybe err more on like 1 month's worth of expenses plus the home, plus, maybe if you have some old cars, you might want to have some extra cash lying around if you need to have things fixed, right? I think that you could sort of look line by line about what would be appropriate or what wouldn't be. In general, though, also, like, are you the kind of person who, if you lost your job, you can kind of take all the fat out of your budget really easily? If so, you can have less in your emergency fund. If you're not the kind of person where, like, you go to the grocery store, you never look at a price, right? Your kids ask for markers, you always buy them for them, right? Like, I'm using silly examples, but it's like if you just literally never think about it, then yeah, you should probably err on having more months worth of expenses rather than just drilling down into what's fixed in my budget that I can't change and putting that aside. And so I think that you can get kind of more specific if you want to, or you could just kind of blanket say, okay, 3 to 6 months is probably enough. If my income's stable, 3 is fine. If it's not, 6 is probably a better number.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. A lot of it comes down to like peace of mind too, right? Like the situation that no Bitcoiner wants to find themselves in is, again, in a forced liquidation situation. Like you've been working so hard, you've been trying to stack sats and stay humble, while you're doing it. And here you are getting forced to go out and sell some because, life happens and things happen and it's unexpected and you cannot predict the future. So it's like, okay, as much as none of us want to hold on to dirty fiat, like, okay, it does still have its uses in taking care of some, especially, short-term unexpected problems.
Yeah,
And
for sure. And having
go
that
ahead.
dirty fiat around, right, is going to enable you to have a better and safer Bitcoin stack, right? At the end of the day, like if you have this emergency fund, which, yeah, if you would put that emergency fund into Bitcoin in 2020, right, like, okay, your emergency fund would be something, right? Okay, fine. I get that. I have an emergency fund. I've done the numbers, right? It hurts. I totally understand. That said, though, right, when I've actually needed that money, it's been there for me. And, God knows we've had our fair share of emergencies over the last 5 years, right, that we've been able to dip into it, replenish it, and we're still stacking and everything's fine, right? And so at the end of the day, not had to sell anything, right? And that's what we're going for here, is that you allocate appropriately, you don't have to sell, and that it actually is what it's supposed to be, which is a long-term savings technology. If you're over allocating, it's not a long-term savings technology for you at that point because you're pulling money out of it in a short-term way, using it to fund short-term expenses, short-term things that are happening. Everyone has uncertainty in their lives, right? And it's what plays into people's risk tolerance. And so people who are more willing to have like a lot of Bitcoin, right, and very little emergency fund generally have a higher risk tolerance because they're willing to, take a risk that these uncertainties aren't going to happen to them. But at the end of the day, right, like, and I don't know if you're religious, but like it's up to God, right? Whether or not these things actually play out. And so you can have a year where, maybe one really bad thing happens, right? And that's it. And everything's fine. Or maybe it's not fine because it's one really bad thing. Or you have a bunch of really little bad things, right, that happen to you. And you're just constantly taking from your emergency fund because I didn't expect this and I didn't expect that and I didn't expect this. All right. And so I don't know what's going to happen to anyone at any given period of time, right? Like, I wish I had a crystal ball. I would like do so many amazing things in this world if I knew what the future was going to be, right? But that's not who anybody is, right? And so the only thing that we can do is plan for things that are going to be unexpected to happen and have, appropriate resources set aside for that.